For my birthday, my son surprised me with a family trip to Europe. Flights, hotels, everything paid for. Or so I thought. At the airport, suitcase in hand, I found out the truth: there was no ticket for me. My own son had planned a luxury vacation across Paris, Venice, and Rome with his friends. I was never invited. That was the day I realized sacrifice doesn't always earn you love. Sometimes, it just makes you the fool. My name is Michael Carter, and for most of my life, I believed that everything I did, every overtime shift, every dollar I saved, every bone deep ache in my body, was for my only son, Lucas. I grew up poor in a small factory town. My father walked out when I was 10, and my mother stretched herself thin just to keep the lights on. I swore that when I became a father, my child would never feel that same hunger or fear. So when Lucas was born, I promised him the world. I worked days climbing ladders as an electrician and nights fixing broken cars in neighbors' garages. There were weeks I barely slept, but when Lucas needed new shoes, a better school, or the newest gadget, I made it happen. I told myself I wasn't just building a future for him, I was breaking the cycle that had weighed down my family for generations. Lucas grew up never knowing the struggle I had faced. And maybe that was my mistake. Because as the years passed, gratitude slowly disappeared from his eyes. By the time he was a teenager, he acted like comfort was his birthright, not my sacrifice. Designer clothes, expensive sports gear, constant vacations with friends, I always found a way to pay, even when it meant putting off fixing my own roof or driving a rusted truck with bald tires. I thought he'd grow out of it. I thought once he was older, once he saw the world for himself, he'd realize how much had been given to him. But entitlement doesn't shrink with age, it grows. By the time Lucas was 25, he didn't just expect things, he demanded them. He laughed at the simple meals I still cooked for myself, sneered at my beat-up tools, and rolled his eyes when I mentioned saving for retirement. "Dad, you'll be fine," he'd say, as if decades of back-breaking work were just background noise to his lifestyle. And then, just when I thought I was losing him completely, he dangled a dream in front of me, a trip across Europe, just the two of us. Paris, Venice, Rome, Barcelona. A father-son adventure we'll never forget, he said. For the first time in years, I felt hope. Maybe this was his way of reconnecting, of thanking me. Maybe we could heal what had been breaking between us. So I said yes. Against every instinct in my body, I drained almost $40,000 from my savings, money I had carefully tucked away from a land deal that had finally paid off. I convinced myself you can't put a price on family, and maybe this trip would remind Lucas of the bond we once had. I spent weeks preparing, counting the days until our flight. I imagined us walking through cobblestone streets, eating fresh bread from Parisian cafes, watching gondolas glide by in Venice. I told myself this was worth it, that my son wanted to share this with me. But I was wrong. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut the morning we arrived at the airport. Lucas stood at the check-in counter, scrolling through his phone. When the attendant asked for my passport and confirmation, confusion spread across her face. She tapped at the keyboard, then frowned. "There's no ticket under your name, sir." I laughed awkwardly, sure it was a mistake. But when I turned to Lucas, he didn't look surprised. He didn't look worried. He looked impatient. "Dad," he said flatly, "there isn't a ticket for you. Just for me and my friends." For a moment, I couldn't process the words. My ears rang, my chest tightened. I stared at the phone screen he held up, confirmation emails for 3 seats. His, and his 2 buddies. Mine? Nowhere to be found. I had emptied my savings, trusted him, dreamed of bonding with him again. And all along, he had been planning a European vacation without me. He told me to just go home and relax, as if I were some unwanted burden. Then, with a smirk, he slung his designer backpack over his shoulder, waved half-heartedly, and disappeared through security with his friends. I stood there, suitcase at my feet, humiliated in front of strangers. Betrayed not by an enemy, but by the one person I had sacrificed everything for. That was the day something inside me hardened. I realized Lucas didn't see me as a father anymore. To him, I was a wallet. An obstacle. Dead weight he could discard when it suited him. But while he thought he had outsmarted me, he didn't know the man I truly was. He saw only the tired electrician, the father who worked himself raw. What he didn't see was the quiet steel that had carried me through decades of struggle. And in that moment, standing alone in that airport terminal, I made myself a promise: if Lucas wanted to treat me like a fool, he was about to learn how dangerous a fool can be when he finally decides to fight back. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his lesson. When Lucas boarded that plane to Europe without me, I thought that humiliation would be the lowest point of my life as a father. But betrayal has a way of digging deeper, finding new ways to cut into the flesh. What I didn't realize in that moment was that the trip was just the beginning. He returned 3 weeks later, tanned and glowing from his adventure. The photos on social media told the story before he even stepped through my door: champagne glasses in Paris, gondola rides in Venice, grinning selfies in front of cathedrals and monuments I had dreamed of seeing. All the things he had promised me, the memories we were supposed to make together, were already splashed across his Instagram, except I was nowhere in them. And when he finally came by the house, he didn't apologize. Not even close. He strolled in like he owned the place, sunglasses still perched on his head, designer shoes tracking dirt onto the floor I had scrubbed just the day before. He tossed his keys on the counter, collapsed onto my couch, and told me the trip was life-changing. Then he had the audacity to thank me for making it possible. Not for joining him. Not for being there. But for funding it. I felt something burn in my chest. Years of exhaustion, years of sacrifices I had justified as for my son's future, all reduced to nothing more than a blank check. He didn't see me as his father anymore. He saw me as a bank account with legs. Still, I stayed quiet. I smiled tightly, nodded, let him talk. Because in that moment, I realized that anger wasn't the right response. Anger would give him power. No, what I needed was patience. And patience, I would learn, could be sharper than any blade. Over the next few weeks, I watched as Lucas's arrogance grew. He bragged about his trip to anyone who would listen. He told relatives how I had decided not to come, spinning the story as if I had been the one to opt out. He joked with his friends that I was too old-fashioned to enjoy Europe anyway. I bit my tongue through it all. But I was listening. One night, while he was in the bathroom, he left his phone on the counter, screen unlocked. I didn't mean to snoop, but curiosity is a powerful thing when your gut is screaming at you. I glanced down and saw a group chat between him and his friends. There it was, in plain text: old man actually believed it was a father-son trip. Can't believe he fell for it. Best scam ever. My vision blurred with rage. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. Scam. That's what my son called me. That's what I was to him: a fool he had tricked, a piggy bank he had cracked open. I put the phone back down before he returned, my face calm, my voice steady. But inside, a storm was building. From that night on, I stopped thinking of Lucas as my son. He was something else now. An enemy. And if he saw me as a fool, then I would let him. I would wear the mask of the naive father he thought he could manipulate. I would play my role perfectly while I prepared for the day the mask came off. I began to gather information quietly. I dug into the accounts I had once shared with him, tracing the transactions he thought I wasn't watching. Thousands gone in a blur of clubs, hotels, luxury purchases. He was burning through money like it grew on trees, bragging about his investments that were nothing more than parties dressed up as business. At first, I wanted to confront him. To slam the bank statements in his face and demand answers. But then I remembered the way he had smirked at the airport, the way he had lied to the family about me choosing not to go. If I confronted him, he would twist it again. He would spin the story until I was the villain. So I stayed silent. Instead, I began making calls. Quietly, carefully, to people I trusted: an old lawyer friend I hadn't spoken to in years, a financial advisor who had handled a client of mine. I asked questions. I laid out scenarios. I planted seeds without ever mentioning Lucas's name. The truth was simple: if Lucas wanted to treat me like an obstacle to his inheritance, I needed to make sure there was nothing left for him to inherit.
By the time autumn rolled around, I had a plan forming.
A slow, deliberate trap that would take time to set, but when sprung, would leave him with nothing.
And Lucas? He was too arrogant to notice.
Too sure of his own cleverness, too blinded by his greed.
He thought he had already won. I let him believe that.
I let him see the father who nodded along, who handed him small amounts of cash when he asked, who smiled tiredly when he bragged about his future. I let him think the mask was real. But behind closed doors, I was sharpening my blade. And the day was coming when Lucas would finally see the truth. After that night with the phone and the scam text, everything changed. The man who'd spent decades teaching his son how to swing a hammer, how to balance a checkbook, how to get back up when life knocked you down, that man didn't vanish. He learned a new trade, patience as Warcraft.
I didn't want headlines.
I didn't want a churchyard spectacle. I wanted work done clean, irreversible, legal. If I was going to strip my son of what he tried to steal, I would do it without turning my life into a courtroom reality show. So I began to move like a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. First, the house. The land deal money hadn't been foolishly spent, it was parked in accounts and property deeds with my name on them.
I started by separating what needed separating.
I scheduled a catch-up with an old attorney, Sam Hargrove, a man who'd once banged nails with me on job sites and later traded his boots for a worn suit. Sam listened in his office while I explained nothing and everything. I told him about the trip, the message on Lucas's phone, the receipts, the late-night calls.
He didn't blink. That's when I knew the plan would have teeth. We rewired my finances quietly.
Sam set up irrevocable trusts and transferred key assets out of reach of impulsive hands. Not by trickery, but with cold, precise paperwork, ownership structures that secured the land, the rental property, and the nest egg. I allocated parts of the windfall to scholarships and to community projects, places where Lucas couldn't argue entitlement. A slice went to me, accessible but shielded.
The rest?
Locked so tight that even if Lucas had 100 lawyers, he'd only find locked doors.
It didn't feel like victory, it felt like insurance.
For the first time in years, I slept without that nagging fear that someone could sign my name away while I was still trying to learn what retirement meant.
While Sam handled legality, I handled optics.
I let Lucas believe he'd won small battles, the ones that gave him confidence without cost. I still handed him a bit of cash when he asked, like a man who didn't see the termite under the floorboards. I let him parade his photos, his stories, his Instagram smugness.
He needed to be louder.
He needed to brag harder. His arrogance would create patterns, and patterns leave tracks.
I hired a private investigator, not out of paranoia but necessity. If I was going to dismantle what he'd built, I needed proof of intent, not just temperament.
The investigator, a discreet woman named Rosa, had been recommended by Sam. She collected what I couldn't get my hands on without looking like a vengeful father: receipts, transaction trails, the kind of pictures that tell truth when people prefer lies. Rosa followed Lucas's movements for weeks, late-night calls to dubious accounts, meetings with men who sold quick fixes and faster pleasures, wires sent to accounts listed under business names that, when traced, led to weekend trips and bottles of champagne rather than legitimate investments. Every time Rosa handed me a new packet, a printout, a time-stamped photo, a recorded conversation, the anger inside me cooled and the plan hardened. These were not the mistakes of a reckless boy, they were the choices of a man treating me like an ATM, and the evidence made the pattern undeniable. I also began cataloging the family story. I made copies of old photos, Ethan's first bike, his 5th birthday cake, the plaster on the wall where he once chased a soccer ball. I kept these not out of sentiment but as contrast, a ledger of what had been given in love and what had been repaid in contempt. It would matter later, when people asked why I'd moved the pieces the way I had.
There were social maneuvers, too.
I invited relatives for small gatherings and let Lucas play host in his own braggadocio. He'd talk loudly about taking care of things, about how Dad had finally learned to loosen up.
A cousin would laugh, a neighbor would nod, and I would tuck those moments away.
His words reached more ears than mine ever had, and those ears would be witnesses when the truth came out. On the nights I was alone, I practiced stillness. I rehearsed how I'd sound when I finally spoke, firm, not furious and factual, not theatrical.
Rage is a public spectacle. Facts are a judge's friend.
I wanted the story to end with the record, not the rant. So I learned to answer with dates, with documents, with receipts that smelled of hotel soap and bad decisions, not with the tremor that had once made me a protective father. There was a temptation to break the silence. To march into his life and tear the headlines down with my hands. But I saw what that would do: give him ammunition. He would scream manipulation, cry control, and gather sympathy the predators he'd been meeting always managed to coax. No, quiet patience was the only currency that would buy me the outcome I wanted. Still, I had to be careful. People talked. People noticed when the sudden attorney meetings happened, when more paperwork appeared on the table. I navigated the thin line of secrecy with the same focus I'd used when wiring a complicated circuit: one wrong connection and everything blew. I told only those who needed to know: Sam, Rosa, and an old friend at the bank who owed me favors. We referred to things in neutral terms: maintenance, restructuring, taxes. It was boring, bureaucratic language that masked the blade underneath. And I baited him, too. Not with lies, but with truth arranged to mislead. I let some documents remain accessible: outdated power of attorney forms, and signed drafts, the kind of things a bored, entitled man would think were loopholes. I left them like a trail of crumbs that would tempt Lucas to reach a hand into a place I'd already sealed. The brilliant, terrible thing about arrogance is that it doesn't ask questions. It assumes. Lucas assumed my compliance, my ignorance. He assumed I wouldn't read his messages, wouldn't follow his receipts. He assumed he could perform a theft dressed as family planning without consequence. He was wrong in every way that counted. Week by week the net closed, subtle as a spring. I watched him loosen his belt. He wasted money on dinners, on investment opportunities, on nonsense. He grew louder, he grew careless. Those were the mistakes that would sink him. A man who brags leaves fingerprints. A man who lies to his father signs his own undoing. Then, one evening, as rain streaked the windows and the house hummed with the quiet of a life someone else had tried to steal, Sam called and said, simply, "We're ready." I folded my hands and looked at the folder on my desk: Rosa's printouts, every bank timestamp, the chat logs, the photos of Lucas with the men who'd patted him on the back and taken his cash. The folder was not a weapon born of malice. It was a ledger of choices. It was my map out of humiliation. I slept that night better than I had in years, not because revenge felt sweet, but because the path forward was finally clear. The plan wasn't born of spectacle. It was a legal, surgical unraveling of a man who believed he could buy life with other people's labor. He'd think he had time. He'd think I was still the gullible old man he dismissed at the airport. When Sam said "we're ready," I felt neither triumph nor joy. I felt a cold, steady readiness. The next act would not be loud. It would be precise. And for the first time since the terminal, I allowed myself to imagine the moment Lucas's smirk would falter and the world that had justified his arrogance would tilt. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. All that remained was the timing. The cruel thing about betrayal is how it blinds the betrayer more than the betrayed. Lucas had been so sure of himself for so long that he never once thought the old man he mocked was quietly tightening a noose around his neck. The opportunity came in early winter. Lucas had been pestering me again, this time with another stack of papers he insisted I sign. He framed it as just simplifying things, a way to make sure the family estate was organized. What he really wanted was access to my land, my accounts, and the last of my savings. "Dad, you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore," he told me with that rehearsed calm of his. "Just sign and I'll handle everything." I didn't argue. I didn't even hesitate. I told him I'd do it, but only at my lawyer's office, so it was official. He agreed immediately, probably too excited to question it. That was his arrogance. He thought he had me cornered. A week later, we walked into Sam's office together. Lucas strutted in like he already owned the place, the swagger of a man about to inherit a kingdom. He slid his papers across the desk, already picturing himself in control. Sam skimmed them, then looked at me. That was the cue. I reached into my briefcase and dropped a folder onto the table. It landed with a thud that echoed louder than Lucas's smug words. Inside was everything: Rose's photographs, bank statements showing his reckless spending, transcripts of conversations where he mocked me, receipts from his so-called investments that were nothing more than nights at clubs and weekends in luxury hotels. Every lie, every betrayal, every scam he'd pulled since the day he left me standing at that airport, it was all there. Sam's voice was steady, almost surgical. "Mr. Carter, your son has left a very clear trail. These documents prove intent to commit financial abuse. If necessary, we can take this to court. But frankly, the evidence speaks for itself." I watched the color drain from Lucas's face. He tried to laugh, tried to wave it off, but the papers didn't care about charm. They told the truth, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. And then came the final blow. I pulled out a single document and placed it on top of the stack, my newly revised will. The one that left Lucas with nothing. Not a dime. Not the house. Not the land. Not even the car he borrowed without asking. Everything had been rerouted into trusts, charities, and accounts he would never touch. For years he had looked at me and seen a fool. In that moment, he saw the man who had been watching him all along. "You wanted control," I told him quietly, my voice steady as steel. "Now you have none." The silence in that office was suffocating. Lucas's hands shook as he gathered his useless papers, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find air. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. But it was over. The trap had sprung. Word spread quickly. Family friends who once believed Lucas's stories about me holding him back now knew the truth. Neighbors whispered about the son who tried to rob his father blind. Even the friends he had taken to Europe began to distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with him. For the first time in months, I felt something lift from my chest. Not joy, not triumph, just release. The weight of humiliation, the sting of betrayal, the fear of losing everything I had built, all of it was gone. I had not only protected myself, but I had shown my son the cost of greed. But revenge has a way of leaving shadows. Because even though Lucas had lost, even though he was stripped of power, I knew this wasn't the end of his anger. Men like him don't accept defeat. They stew in it. They sharpen it into something darker. And as I walked out of Sam's office that day, the folder of evidence tucked under my arm, I realized something: I had won the battle. But the war with my son might not be over. After that day in Sam's office, the world felt quieter. Not calmer, not happier, just quieter. Lucas walked out with nothing but his arrogance, and I walked away with my life's work still intact. At first, I thought I would feel joy. After all, I had one. I had protected my home, my savings, my dignity. I had shown my son that I wasn't the fool he believed me to be. But instead of joy, what settled inside me was something colder. A stillness, like the silence after a storm tears through and leaves everything broken in its wake. The house was emptier than ever. Not because Lucas had moved out, he hadn't lived there in years, but because something final had snapped between us. The fragile thread connecting father and son had been cut clean through. He didn't take it quietly, of course. He raged. He spread lies, told anyone who would listen that I had turned on him, that I had betrayed him. He painted me as a paranoid old man who was jealous of his success. But gossip only travels so far when there's hard evidence stacked against it. The documents, the receipts, the photographs, they spoke louder than his tantrums. Slowly, the whispers died down, and people began to see him for what he was. Yet that didn't stop me from grieving. One evening, I found myself digging through an old box in the attic. Inside was a photograph of Lucas at 8 years old, beaming as he held up the kite we had built together. I stared at that picture for a long time, wondering if that boy still existed somewhere under all the greed and entitlement. Or had I lost him long before I ever realized? That thought haunted me more than his betrayal. Because revenge may protect what you've built, but it doesn't heal the wound of knowing your own blood was willing to destroy you. Still, I reminded myself why I did what I did. I hadn't acted out of spite. I had acted out of survival. Lucas didn't just want my money, he wanted to erase me, to strip me of everything while I was still breathing.
That wasn't a son reaching for independence. That was a vulture circling, waiting for me to collapse. And I couldn't allow it.
In the weeks that followed, I made final arrangements with Sam.
My estate was sealed tighter than a vault. My assets were protected by trusts that Lucas could never penetrate.
Charities, scholarships, community projects, places where the money would actually make a difference. Every loophole he might try to exploit was shut.
Sam asked me once, quietly, if I wanted to leave Lucas anything at all. Even a small portion, he said. I shook my head.
A man who tries to steal from you while you're alive doesn't deserve to inherit when you're gone.
And that was that.
The last time Lucas came to see me, he didn't come with apologies.
He came with venom.
He shouted, cursed, swore I'd regret cutting him off. His face twisted with rage I barely recognized, as if I were staring into the eyes of a stranger. When he finally stormed out, slamming the door behind him, I knew that was the last time I'd ever see him. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. These days, my life is quieter. I wake up early, sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and watch the sunrise over the land I fought so hard to protect. I tend to my garden, I read books I never had time for, and sometimes I take long drives just to feel the road under my tires.
But every now and then, I think about him.
About the boy I raised, the man he became, and the choice he made. I wonder if he ever thinks about me not as the father who cut him out, but as the father who taught him a lesson he'll never forget.
People say revenge doesn't heal. Maybe they're right. I don't feel healed. But I do feel free.
And in a world where even your own son can turn against you, freedom is the closest thing to victory.
If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: blood doesn't equal loyalty. It never has. Loyalty is earned. And once it's broken, there's no stitching it back together. Lucas wanted everything I had.
In the end, I gave him nothing.
And I walked away free.
Would you forgive a betrayal like this, or walk away forever?
Tell me in the comments.